TorahCafe.com.
This mini class is about Nachmanides, the Ramban. But I want to begin with something from Maimonides, from the Rambam, who we really discussed in the last little segment. There is an interesting tradition about Kitzim. That means to say that great rabbis would make predictions as to when Mashiach would come, when the exile would end. And we have a whole list of rabbis offering us a whole list of dates, usually close to the time that they themselves lived, which of course have come and gone, and there's much discussion on it, which is not important for us at the moment. Maimonides himself, who was officially a non-mystic, but there's a lot of indications, a lot of suggestion that he was in fact a great mystic, had such a prediction. He predicted Mashiach would come at a certain date, and essentially it would be the year 4,976, which would be in the common count, if I'm not wrong, the year 1216. To give you a framework, Maimonides himself passed away in 1204. So he predicted during his lifetime that in the year 1216 there'd be a renewal of prophecy. That's how he put it. A renewal of prophecy. The basis for this claim was a tradition that he had heard from his father, who heard from his father all the way back to the time of the Second Temple. That in the year 2488, Bilam discussed how God's relationship with the world is through the Jewish people. And he says, Ka'es, at a time like this, the world is going to say to Yisrael and to Yaakov, the world is going to speak to the Jewish people and ask them, Ma pa'al kel, what is God busy with? So he had a tradition that said, just as in the year 2488, Bilam acknowledged that God's relationship with the world was through the Jewish people, when the same number of years would lapse a second time, the world would reach a state where they would be asking, Ma Paul Kel, they'd be asking the Jew, what is God doing? 2 times 2,488 is 4,976. And Rambam therefore predicted, and again he heard it from his father and his grandfather till the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, that in the year 4976 prophecy would return to the Jewish people. This is considered a precursor, a stage set for the coming of Mashiach. So the Rebbe discussed this on a number of occasions. And the Rebbe, of course, says that although all of these great rabbis predicted dates for the coming of Mashiach, which never materialized, it's impossible to say that their predictions were absolutely futile. There has to be a redeeming aspect, because rabbis of this caliber simply don't make mistakes. And therefore the Rebbe points out that at the time that the Rambam speaks of, 1216, 4976 in our calendar, there was a radiation of Kabbalah, which was new and much greater than what had been available until then. There were a group of individuals who were considered very holy men. One of them was actually called, officially, a prophet. There was Rabbi Avraham HaChassid, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, Rabbi Eliezer HaKeach, and a whole series of others, who lived around the time of this prediction of Rambam, who were incredibly great mystics. And the Rebbe links these great mystics and their lives and their teachings to the Rambam's prediction for the return of prophecy. Because, as we've been learning throughout this entire series of conversations, prophecy and mysticism are really synonymous. In prophecy, the purity and the enlightenment is far greater than it is in mysticism, but nevertheless, what's true, prophecy and mysticism essentially are about the same thing. So, a little while after the time of Rambam himself predicts something would happen in the world that would open up a new era of prophecy. And the Rebbe discusses this and says, there have always been prophets. There's always been mysticism and spirituality. But that the date that the Rambam predicts for the return of prophecy doesn't simply mark the return of prophecy, but it marks the beginning of the coming of Mashiach, which is now 900 years old. In other words, from this point, the Avraham HaChassid, the Yehuda HaChassid, the Eliezer HaKech, and Rabbeinu Yoina, and so on, begins what will be a revolution in Kabbalah, a re-radiation of mysticism that is, so to speak, an endeavor, an effort at going back to the emphasis on spirituality and enlightenment, which was how things were in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash. In other words, Mashiach is going to come. When Mashiach comes, the Beis HaMikdash will be built. The Jewish nation will return to live in the Holy Land en masse. At that point, spirituality and mysticism will again become the center of Jewish life. Prophecy is going to return. There's going to be a possibility of people to achieve the kind of perfection necessary to be in this state. And the Rebbe says, from the date that the Rambam predicted, that process of the re-radiation of Kabbalah as a stage setter for what ultimately would become the full radiation of Kabbalah, and then how that evolves into Chassidus, which all sets up the coming of Mashiach, begins. So it's a long and arduous, long and slow process, beginning, I guess, 900 years ago. And of course, one of the great personalities of that era was the great Nachmanides, Ramban. The Ramban lived in Spain, and he managed to get himself into some trouble, which forced him to spend the last years of his life in the Holy Land in Israel. The Holy Land he came to was completely destroyed, desolate, completely destroyed by the Mongols and so on. But the great Ramban didn't see desert. He didn't see destruction. He saw what the Talmud says, that if you live in the Holy Land, you become smarter. He saw what the Talmud says, when you're living in the Holy Land, you have a God, you're closer to God Almighty. And his philosophical model of Jewish practice, Jewish life, revolves more than any other rabbi around the holiness of the Holy Land. Because Nachmanides went to the Holy Land and he experienced its light, he experienced its soul. In other words, Nachmanides became a mystic, became in effect, on some level, the idea of a prophet, by moving from the diaspora, moving from Spain to the Holy Land. And he therefore pounds away, reminds you and reminds you and reminds you again and again and again and again about the holiness of the Holy Land, and that all the mitzvahs that we do in our entire religious life that we're doing today is considered to him almost a rehearsal for how things are going to be when Mashiach comes. And what's interesting, he received Kabbalah from the Rebbe Ezriel and Rebbe Uziel, the disciples of Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nor that I mentioned in the previous class. He wrote a book, a commentary on Chumash. It's considered one of the last things he wrote in his incredibly successful and prolific life. And in the book on Chumash, there's finally mysticism. In his works of halacha, his interpretation of Talmud, you don't see mysticism. But in his commentary on Chumash, you see a lot of Kabbalah. Because at this point in his life, he'd become expert at Kabbalah, and he incorporated it into his commentary. And he writes in the introduction something very odd. He says, I'm including secrets of the Torah, and I'm telling you up front, you'll never understand them. Don't even attempt to understand them, because you'll be wasting your time. So imagine a man tells you, I'm writing a book, and I'm including sections of the book that no one can understand, so don't even bother reading them. And of course, you scratch your head and you say to Ben Damakuli, if nobody could read them, what's the point of publishing them? And yet Ramban does exactly that. He tells you, don't even bother figuring it out, and then he puts it in his book. Now, since the time of Nachmanides, which is a very long time ago, Kabbalah has radiated and expanded and deepened. And it is quite possible nowadays to study the Nachmanides Kabbalah and understand it. In fact, there's a number of complete commentaries on the Nachmanides work of Kabbalah, bringing forward the Nachmanidean form, which is quite vague, quite abstract, to the I guess a lesser level of mystic. But Nachmanides writes, I'm incorporating Kabbalah into my work, although I don't expect people to be able to understand it. To give you an example of Nachmanides' mysticism, I'll just give you one, okay? We read in the scripture, read in the Tanakh, read in the Bible, that God rested in the temple, in the Beis HaMikdash, which creates a very, very big controversy. How can God be in time and space? If God is in one place and not in another, how does the other place exist? It's a terribly controversial question. And so much has been written on this question. And the question ultimately becomes, what is the meaning of God dwelling in a house? So the first question is, how can you say God is one place and not another? The second place is, how can God be concentrated into a visible form? How can you see him? How can God be concentrated into a physical space? And so on. So here again, you have a debate between philosophers and mystics. The philosophers will tell you that in the Beis HaMikdash there was no presence of God. There was the presence of the Shekhinah. But the philosophers hold that the presence of the Shekhinah really is like an angel, a created form, like a cloud, that's not godly. It's not God, it's not even godliness. It's a created being that's representative of the fact that God is here. In other words, if you went into the temple, according to the philosophers, you couldn't see God. You couldn't see God in the temple, just like you could not see God anyplace else. It was that in the temple there was a presence, there was an energy of something which is not God, which is called in the holy language Kavod Nivra. Kavod Nivra means a created form of honor as opposed to an emanated form of honor, and so as opposed to a light of God that's supposed to be representative of his presence. So Rambam, many other philosophers, when they talk about God resting in the Beis HaMikdash, have to argue that there's no way that means that God is sitting in the Beis HaMikdash. He's either everywhere or nowhere. It means that there's something representing him in the Beis HaMikdash, be it an angel and so on. Nachmanides says, the mystic says, no, there is a concept of divine light. Godliness, as we call it. Godliness is different than God, that's a reflection of God. And because there is a concept of godliness, there is a concept of God's presence in the Beis HaMikdash. God's presence in the Beis HaMikdash is not simply an angel or a cloud that has a gestalt that's representing him, but there's actually a light or an enlightenment from godliness which is present in the Beis HaMikdash. This is one of a series of examples, of many examples, of Nachmanidean mysticism, I'm just going to finish with another thought which is very, very interesting. And that is that in the introduction to his commentary on Chumash, the Ramban makes an observation. And the observation is that when you read the biblical narrative, it reads like a story. God is speaking to Moses. And of course the question becomes, if God is speaking to Moses, who is saying God is speaking to Moses? Who's the narrator? Who's the storyteller? So the Nachmanides introduces an idea called Shlishi HaMedaber, the third person. The unknown principle, that's the narrator of God speaking to Moses. And the Nachmanides doesn't say much on it, but Chassidus very, very thoroughly analyzes and develops those few words of Shlishi HaMedaber and makes the following explanation. That God is telling the story of the Torah, including telling the story of God speaking to Adam or to Abraham or to Moses. Because the idea that God speaks to Abraham or to Moses or to Adam is a revelation. It's a form, if you will. It's making himself available to them through some kind of a form. The narrator who is speaking the Torah is God as he is above that form. In other words, the names of God are employed in the Torah to describe God speaking to man. The one telling the story of God with a name speaking to man is the unnamed God, is the truth of God, which is even higher than a name. So in this case, we're finding an example in a Ramban, in a Nachmanides, who not only speaks of the names of God in the Sephirus, but he speaks also about the formlessness, the nameless God that's higher than the named God, if you will, which is the source, which is the basis for the meeting between godliness and man as described in the Torah. And this is just a couple of thoughts and words about the Ramban. In our next section, we'll visit the story of the rediscovery of the Zohar and the great excitement that it elicited and the new controversies that it introduced.